Hey everyone, welcome back to Bleyl Dev. Today we're going to be going over how to do some social authentication using Firebase. We're going to be doing some Google authentication as well as some Twitter authentication. So let's dive into it. For this example, I'm going to assume that you already know how to set up your project on Firebase. If you don't, you can see prior FlutterFire 101 videos, and we show you how to do the setup there. The one thing that we're going to be focusing on though today that's a little bit different is the sign-in method in the Firebase console. We're going to go over to sign-in method, and we're going to start with Google, and then we're going to do Twitter afterwards. So let's start with Google. So we're going to say enable. Okay. Project support email, select the default email, go ahead and click save. The one last thing that we want to do after we've set up our sign-in method is we want to go back to our project overview, back to your app setup, and what we're going to do is we're going to re-download the latest Google service-info.plist for iOS and the Google JSON file for Android. The reason for this is if you download it and we open it up, you'll see here that we have this new value called reversed client ID. And this is necessary in order for us to utilize the Google APIs and to sign in a user into our application with Google. If you're trying to run on iOS, there's a decent chance that you're going to need to take your reverse client ID, copy it, and then you're going to need to place it inside of a URL type object. If you don't see one defaulted here, you can click the plus button and add one, and then paste it into the URL schemas. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add in the plugins necessary for this project. So what we're going to do for that is we're going to pull open FlutterFire, the documentation, and we're going to make sure that we have the auth and core, the latest versions. Go to our pubspec.yaml file. Let's add those dependencies. And then we're going to need one more dependency for this video, and that is the Google dependency. So if you go to social auth, you'll see this Google sign-in. Okay, go ahead and add that, and we're good to go. And you can see here that I've created a very basic app. All it is a simple sign-in button. Right now it does nothing, but we're going to add in a method in a file called socialauth.dart, and that is going to do a Google authentication login. So the first thing that we want to add into our social auth method is a future of type user credential called sign in Google. Make it asynchronous. Okay. And now we want to add our dependencies. So we add Firebase auth, and we also want to add our Google sign in. Okay. And the next thing that we're going to be doing is we want to set up a couple of objects. So the first one that we want to do is of type Google sign-in account, and we're just going to call this user, and that's going to be equal to await Google sign-in dot sign-in. Okay. The next one is going to be of type Google sign-in authentication, and I'm just going to call that auth. And that's going to be equal to await user.authentication. The third one that we need to add is the Google credential. So we're going to say Google auth credential. And I'm just going to call that credential. And that's going to be set equal to Google auth provider dot credential. And credential is going to take in 2 arguments. Let's go ahead and roll over so we can see this. Let's expand that. And it's going to have an access token, which we're going to say is equal to our auth object dot access token. And then the second one is going to be an ID token, which is going to be equal to our auth object dot ID token. Okay. And the last thing that we need to do to sign in with Google is we need to say return await Firebase auth.instance.signin with credential, and then we pass our credential. And I spelled credential wrong. There we go. Okay. Last thing to do is to hook this up to our button, and we'll try out our sign in with Google. So we go to our button widget. Let's see here, on pressed, and I'm going to make this asynchronous. Say await sign in Google. One last thing that we want to make sure we add into our method, if you haven't done this at the root of your project already, be sure to instantialize Firebase. And so with the new FlutterFire plugins, you need to include firebase.initializeApps somewhere in your application. The suggested and typical place to put it, assuming you're always going to use Firebase when you open up your app, is just to place it right here in your main method. But for this purpose, we're going to put it right here in our sign in with Google method. Let's restart that app. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And once we run it, I'll go ahead and click sign in. It's going to prompt the user the first time if it wants to allow the app to share information about you. In other words, it's basically the user is giving permission to utilize Google. And then the user just signs in. There we go. And the user is now authenticated and signed in. If we go over to Firebase, you'll now see here on the authentication page that Bleyl dev at Gmail is an authenticated user and has its own user ID. Tells you when they last signed in, when the account was created, and so on. The next one that we're going to do is Twitter. For this one, I'm actually going to utilize an existing account. So I've actually already integrated Twitter into this application. And I'm going to show you the process by which I did that. Now, the reason why I'm not doing it from scratch is because Twitter developers limits you on the free tier to just a single project. So I've actually already set up this project to handle and integrate with Twitter. And so we're going to utilize that. And I'm just going to show you the steps by which you can create a project on Twitter Developer, how you can integrate it with Firebase, and we're going to show you how to set up the methods in your application to do an authenticated Twitter login. So when you first go to developer.twitter.com, you should see a page like this. And you'll see something down here, early access, blah, 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 learn. There's a lot of different things that you can look at. But what you want to see is the products and then Twitter API. That's what we're interested in. Then what you're going to say is you're going to do apply for access, apply for a developer account, and you'll then be prompted to go through a process to apply for a developer account. You need to fill out a form stating what your intentions are. So if you're trying to monetize a site or something, if it's planned for commercial use, personal use, side project, just exploring, etc. And once you do all of that, you'll be given access to V1.1 and V2. And that'll give you access to all the basic authentication, APIs, all that stuff. The next thing that you're going to do is you're going to utilize the keys that you've been given access to. So you'll see here keys and tokens. And you'll be using the API key and secret in Firebase. When we come to the authentication page on Firebase and we go to the sign-in method, if we go down to Twitter, we're going to click edit and we're going to click enabled. I'm not going to pull it up because it's going to show your API and your secret key. Now those are the two fields that you need to fill in, and that information can be found here, the API key and the secret. These consumer keys are what you're going to need in order to set up authentication for Twitter. Once you're done with that, there's going to be a little URL at the bottom of the panel. So for example, when I pull open these, there's a bunch of different options. They're all very similar, but at the very bottom, you'll see a callback URL, and you need to copy that. And here, let me go back to the root. Scroll down. You'll see under authentication settings, we need to place our callback URL here. And the reason for that is that's basically going to say, the Twitter APIs are going to look and see, okay, where is that authentication request coming from? And it's going to make sure you have the proper keys and all that. And it's going to allow the authenticated user to sign in with Twitter if it's originating from these callback URLs. So that's how you set that up. The next thing we need to do is we need to actually set up our code. So signing up through Twitter is a little bit more simple. First of all, we don't need additional plugins. We're just going to use the Firebase plugins for authentication. All we need to do is we need to establish a Twitter auth provider object. So we're going to type Twitter auth provider, Twitter provider is equal to Twitter auth provider. And all of this is in a service that I created. And what I'm going to do then is, utilizing this Twitter provider, I am then going to, inside of my sign-in method, say await Firebase auth.instance.signin with popup and pass my Twitter provider. And what this is going to do, I'm going to go to shut up and tweet. So this is the prod version of this app right now. So if I sign out, so what's going to happen is when I click this button, it's going to trigger this Twitter sign-in method. And you'll see here, it pops up that Twitter authentication modal. Since I'm already signed in Twitter on my computer, it's automatically just going to log me in. Now, if a user is not signed in already, it is going to prompt them to enter their Twitter handle as well as their password, and then it'll authenticate them. So reviewing the steps again, we first need to get access to Twitter Developer API. Second, we need to hook it up to our application on Firebase. And we do that by going to the sign-in option. So let's go back there. We do that by going to authentication, sign-in method, and this Twitter sign-in provider. And we fill out the necessary information. We then take the callback URL provided for us and we place it inside of our project on Twitter Developer. And then lastly, what we're going to do is we create a Twitter auth provider object, and then we pass that to the sign in with popup method. Now, what you're going to do is, if you want to see is the user signed in or not, like was it successful, all you need to do is create a method that checks the current auth state of the user, and it sees, okay, is the user authenticated or not authenticated? And you can either send them into the application if they're authenticated, or block them from signing in and keep them on that same page where they repeatedly have to keep hitting the button until they get it right and are authenticated. And one last note, as always, if you have any questions or are confused by anything, be sure to check out the Firebase documentation. They put a lot of effort into creating some clean, very easy to read FlutterFire authentication documentation. And so just consult the social auth tab of authentication if you have any questions. I'll be sure to put a link to that in the description below. If you haven't already, make sure you click that like button and subscribe to the channel for weekly Flutter content, and I'll catch you guys next time.